Archives of Prasar Bharati presents the timeless treasure of golden era.
Now, it's not the prevention of war as such, but keeping peace. Peacekeeping has become the major responsibility of the United Nations. You must have been involved in so many peacekeeping operations, so many peacekeeping forces have been there, and you must have been involved in some of these activities. Please tell us various places where these peacekeeping operations were conducted and what were your involvement in those things.
The first major peacekeeping operation in which I was not personally involved, but which Hammarskjöld set up, was the United Nations Emergency Force after the Suez War in 1956, the fall of September 1956. But that was Hammarskjöld's personal work, and Ralph Bunche looked after the UNEF. Then, of course, the Congo was the next major operation in 1960. And in 1961, I became involved in that because of this Lumumba assassination and so on, the withdrawal of all African forces from the ONUC, and we needed to get replacements, and I came to India to plead with Nehru, and Panditji agreed to send an entire brigade, and it was that brigade that ended the secession of Katanga, and it ended the civil war in the Congo for all practical purposes. We Indians did that. I can say that without any fear of contradiction. We did that. General Premchand, Brigadier Narona, Brigadier Raja, relative of Kumarasamy Raja. Yes, these were the people who did that, you see. Now, in any number of peacekeeping operations, of which the Cyprus one is a major one continuing.
Even today they are there in peacekeeping forces.
It was started in 64 for 3 months. And after 32 years, it's still going strong. But because in 64, you might recall, I'd mentioned to you the financial crisis on account of the failure to peacekeeping charges. The Cyprus operation is to this day run on the basis of voluntary funding.
Even today?
There is no assessment for the US peacekeeping force. But for all other peacekeeping operations, and there are a number of them, Bosnia no longer, but we had Somalia, we still have observation groups in the Middle East. For example, what is called UNDOF, you see, in Syria. We have got that. These are all paid for by a special assessment scale, which is accepted by the member governments, and they are paid for in that way. But the main point I want to make is this, you see. Two mistakes have been made in my judgment in recent years. I wrote an article on peacekeeping, an overview about a year ago, which was published in the Hindu and was very well commented upon by people who had read it. The first mistake is to get involved in civil war situations. We made that mistake in the Congo and paid dearly for it. Bosnian situation is a civil war situation, and Somalia was the worst example of a civil war situation. If you are interposing between two sovereign states, the sovereign states have control over their forces. You can do something. But in a civil war situation, there is no control on either side. Liberia, for example. If we got involved in Liberia, it would be a terrible situation. Now, this does not mean that the United Nations does not have a role to play, a humanitarian role, nothing else. The Red Cross role, the High Commissioner for Refugees role, that should be our role. And in Somalia, we started as a humanitarian responsibility. We went further and tried to put an end to civil war, and then we had all kinds of contradictions. One day this man Aidi was a villain. He should be captured and shot. The next day the United States was sending a special plane to take him to Addis Ababa for a meeting of the Organization for African Unity to negotiate peace and so on. All these contradictions happened, and then some American soldiers were killed, and then immediately they said they are going to withdraw. That comes to my second point. You should never involve any of the major powers in the peacekeeping operations. Leave them out. India has lost any number of people, but on that account we have not said we should withdraw from all peacekeeping operations. That is the mistake that was made. In the case of the Cyprus operation, there was an already existing British contingent. Now, the British are one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. So an exception was made at that time with both eyes wide open, so to speak, on the part of the United Nations. And that has not led to any complications. But anywhere else, wherever we have taken forces from the 5 permanent members, we have had difficulties. Another reason for that is this. The 5 permanent members have got global interests in the outcome of a particular peacekeeping situation. They are an interested party. Therefore, their troops cannot be expected to behave as just United Nations, what they call the blue helmets or whatever they are called, you see. That's another reason why. I am not saying that they will do that, but that fear is there. That's the reason why I feel that's a mistake to involve any peacekeeping forces from the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Those examples are rare, and I think in the future people will be even more careful and wary not to induct forces from these countries. Now, NATO is a totally different proposition altogether. In Bosnia, after we left, the United Nations left, and the NATO peacekeeping forces took over, that's their responsibility. The United Nations has nothing to do with that. But at that time, it was a mistake to have put in any forces from any of these other countries. Logistic support is different. We can borrow planes from them because planes fly according to the directions of the pilots.
Yes.
They don't have their own course to set, you see, to suit the interests of the United States or any other country. Logistic support, we can even borrow equipment like tanks and ballistic missiles and so on, if necessary, but not peacekeeping forces on the ground.
Would you say that it was because American pressure that this civil war situation, the United Nations had to go in? What kind of role United States played in that? Many people think that it was America which forced United Nations into the civil war interventions. Is it true?
I believe so, sir. You see, the President Clinton once said we are involved in situations where we should never have been involved. Who put them there? The Security Council in every case passed a resolution. In every case, the Security Council resolution has to be approved by the United States amongst others. The United States cannot, as a member of the Security Council, authorize a peacekeeping operation, because when it is authorized, the Secretary General has no choice in the matter. He has to go forward and set up the troops and set up the peacekeeping operation. And then for the United States to say, tongue in cheek, you should never have been there. Yes, but who put us there? You, the United States, did that. That's a very good question. This is not commonly understood by people. As a member of the Security Council, you authorize an operation and then you say the United Nations should not be there. That's not fair. That's contradictory. That's not meaningful. That's not fair. That's not reasonable.
What about the Vietnam situation? It was a very peculiar situation. It was completely out in American operation, or was there any involvement in that?
See, from 1964 to 1975, from the days of Lyndon Johnson, this Vietnam situation arose. From the very beginning, U Thant was the sole voice of sanity. He said repeatedly, publicly, this is a conflict which cannot be solved by military means. It can be solved only by negotiation. And behind the scenes, he tried to organize meetings between representatives of the Hanoi Ho Chi Minh Group and the United States. He had even arranged everything in 2 possible venues. One was Rangoon, where he had some influence as a Burmese himself, and the other was in Warsaw, in Poland. These meetings did not take place for a variety of reasons into which we need not go. A very distinguished American journalist called Eric Sevareid has written a whole history of that. But in 1975, when finally peace was agreed upon between the 2 countries, and Kissinger and the North Vietnam representative got the Nobel Peace Prize for signing this peace treaty, the agreement was entirely on the lines that U Thant had suggested 10 years earlier. But it must also be said, to the credit of Lyndon Johnson, in December 1966, when U Thant had completed his first term and was due to be re-elected, he had already said he did not want a second term. He had said that openly. The man who prevailed upon him to accept a second term was Lyndon Johnson. The most vociferous critic of the Vietnam operations of the United States, U Thant, he was urged by Lyndon Johnson to accept a second term. That speaks volumes of the magnanimity of Lyndon Johnson. That political disagreement did not bother him. He realized that here is a man of rare integrity, and that the United Nations will be well served by his continuing for a second term. And all that has been discussed in detail in my book.
This peacekeeping operation, is it there in the original UN Charter, or is it a later development from other articles because of interpretation or because new resolutions passed by? Because we don't come across that word peacekeeping operations anywhere in the UN Charter.
Oh, there is.
There is.
Not peacekeeping as such, but Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 of the Charter
peace and
deal with
security.
peacekeeping. The only difference is Chapter 6 deals with peaceful means of resolving disputes, and Chapter 7 envisages a situation where the United Nations can send forces into a country. Enforcement, what's called enforcement, that's possible. Now, we are actually not indulged in enforcement at any given time, but the authority to do so is vested in the Security Council under the Charter. But basically, all peacekeeping operations fall somewhere between chapter 6 and chapter 7. That's what Hammarskjöld used to say. They are not really chapter 6, they are more than chapter 6, because they are not just peaceful settlement of disputes, but they are not enforcement. Because when you go into a country, you go into a country because that country comes to the United Nations and asks for assistance from the United Nations. And that's how we established a peacekeeping operation. Cyprus did that. The Congo did that. In every case, it was as a result of an appeal by the country concerned to the United Nations that a peacekeeping operation was initiated.
Now, how does Kashmir fits into this kind of a situation? This peacekeeping, but we did not have the UN force as such, but they played a major part in getting the ceasefire agreement, and then they had to keep what is called this peaceful boundary between the two countries.
There is still an organization called UNMOGIP to this day.
United Nations
Military Observer Group in India and Pakistan. This is to sort of police the ceasefire line between what you might call Azad Kashmir and our Indian Kashmir to this day.
But it's a slight different from the peacekeeping force as such. There is a difference.
Yes, peacekeeping can take several forms. And I told you about this peacekeeping organization in Syria. That's also an observer group. An observer group simply monitors the truce on a given line. They report violations of the truce, and as a result of that, you can have a Security Council meeting. And if they say Pakistan violated the ceasefire, then the United Nations will accept that and pass strictures against Pakistan. They are an independent group of observers, and that is the reason for this existence. But talking about Kashmir,
no military action is involved in that. No army presence, nothing of that sort.
The military observer group consists of about 40 or 50 officers.
And that's all.
Then nothing more than that. Now, the 2 or 3 other things happened. For example, you see, the resolution of the Security Council called for a plebiscite in India, called for a plebiscite. And that plebiscite, of course, was never held because it called for withdrawal of Pakistan from Azad Kashmir. It called for so many other preconditions, and that has never come about. And now it is not in the realm of practical politics even to imagine that we will have a peacekeeping, what shall I say, at any given time in the future, that we will have a referendum or a plebiscite in Kashmir. It is practically out of the question. But the Kashmir situation called for a peacekeeping observer group to watch the ceasefire line. Did not call for establishment of any. But later on, in '66.
Excuse me, sir, but there was some initiative from the Security Council even to get the ceasefire agreement between the two countries, wasn't there?
No, this UNMOGIP is established as a result of a Security Council resolution. Absolutely. But they also appointed a mediator. I forget the name of the mediator, it's in my book. He was the head of a university. I forget his name, but it will come back to me. I can mention it tomorrow. I can look it up for you. And he was appointed the mediator. But he had nothing to mediate because India would not accept his mediation. India has never accepted United Nations mediation in Kashmir. It's a matter of principle for India that this is a bilateral issue between the two countries. The only mediation that we accepted was in Tashkent. When Brezhnev got the two countries to agree to the Tashkent Declaration. And then, of course, the Simla Declaration and so on. That these problems will be settled between the two countries, bilateral discussion. But India had a role to play in 2 occasions between India and Pakistan. In '65, when there was open fighting between India and Pakistan, and most importantly, in 1971 December, when East Pakistan was in revolt, and a force was sent from Pakistan, West Pakistan, to put down that revolt, and India had to interfere and to prevent bloodshed. And we went in there. General Manekshaw was the head of the Indian forces there, and we went there and we restored law and order, and that was the end of East Pakistan and the beginning of Bangladesh. So if there is any one person who can be said to be the father of Bangladesh, it is India. India is the country that made it possible for Bangladesh to come into existence. I have also mentioned in my book, Mujib-ur-Rahman was at that time a prisoner in West Pakistan. And there was a report that his life was in danger. And I recall distinctly, because Houthon told me that immediately after Bhutto had left him, he pleaded with Bhutto to save Mujib's life. Now, as you know, Mujib's life was saved. And he went back as the head of the government in Bangladesh. And as happened with our own Gandhiji, a Bangladeshi murdered him. The assassin was a Bangladeshi.
Sir, again another important issue is relevant to our Indian conditions was this Goa. I think the Dutch, they could not reconcile to the loss of Goa, and they took the issue to Security Council. So what happened there for the issue? How did the United Nations come to the picture? Wasn't it finally how it was solved?
It came into the picture in a somewhat different way. First of all, the British left in good order, and then the French showed rare statesmanship, and they relinquished all the small territories that they held in India, Puducherry, called Pondicherry, Karaikal and Chandranagur. These were the three main sort of city-states. And they withdrew on condition that the French influence and French culture would be preserved, as they are to this day.
Exactly.
But so far as the Portuguese colonies in India are concerned, they were all on the west coast, Goa, Daman and Diu. These were the three. And they were treated as the overseas territories of Portugal. They were supposed to be part of Portugal. And this angered India.
I'm sorry, I mentioned Dutch, it should be Portuguese, yes.
Portuguese. What happened was, any attempt to settle this by negotiation, as was so successful with France, was a failure. Now we are talking about the year 1961. We had been independent for 14 years at that time. It was at that point that the government of India decided, I understand that the most forceful advocate of taking over Goa by force was Krishna Menon, who was then defense minister. And whether there were divided councils, I do not know, I doubt it. But what angered India was the declaration in Washington, D.C. at a meeting with John Foster Dulles by the visiting foreign minister of Portugal, that the United States had no doubt about the sovereignty of Portugal over Goa. This was a red rag, so to speak. And as you know, Goa had no defense. The Indian forces just marched and took them over, and the same with Daman and Diu. And then, of course, Portugal brought the issue to the Security Council. There, we had a very good case, and it could have been argued differently, but my dear friend and colleague C.S. Jha went to the extreme step of declaring, charter or no charter, Goa belongs to us. That was unfortunate. But anyhow, that's all past history. The only amusing part of this Goa business was that shortly after the occupation of Goa by military force, there was a cartoon showing Krishna Menon as a big python, what they call a boa constrictor. What we call the python is called in Latin America, in Brazil for example, it's called the boa, B-O-A, constrictor. Constrictor because it kills its prey by winding itself round them and squeezing them until they die, and then eats
swallows it.
Yes, that's its way of making easier for it to digest what it takes. It showed Krishna Menon, the head of Krishna Menon, and then a big bulge in the middle, and it called Krishna Menon the Goa Constrict. One episode I recall. As it was, as it happened, this was in 1961. And by 1962 or 63, the whole thing had been forgotten. Today we are on very good terms with Portugal. And in fact, the United Nations, there was a boycott of Portuguese goods declared by the Security Council.
Is it?
Because of this Mozambique and Angola and the refusal of, and also Portuguese Guinea, refusal of Portugal to negotiate with for the independence of these countries.
All become independent.
And Portugal is now a member of NATO and a very respected member of the international community. We have got an embassy in Portugal and everything is okay.
So, as I started this session, as I said, your great institution building role at the United Nations. So, could you tell us something about the institutions that you were able to bring into existence and how the idea came to you? How did the idea come to you? And finally, what kind of steps you had to take in order to launch these various institutions, like the, already you mentioned something about the UNDP, already mentioned, then this UNITAR, and then this UN University, and then international schools. Number of these institutions, they came during, and mostly at your initiative. So please tell us something of the various aims and objectives, the organizational structure, the kind of work they are doing. Please tell us something about that.
I'll be glad to do that, to respond. In fact, if I look back on my work at the United Nations, what makes me feel good about it is the role I had in establishing institutions which have stayed on and done some useful work. Now, I have already mentioned the Mekong and the UNDP. These are, UNDP is still going strong. These are two major achievements.
Is Mekong now completed the project?
No,
or
it has just started actually.
So it's some more has to be done.
In fact, it was only last year that they adopted a new resolution for reactivating the work on the Mekong, the four riparian countries. So it's going forward. But there is a lot of work to be done. It's not just one project. It's a number of projects on the various tributaries to the Mekong that is involved. And that work will go on for the next, just as the harnessing of rivers in India will go on forever. That will go on for a very long time.
Yes.
That is Mekong. UNDP, UN Development Program, brought about by the merger of the UNTAB and the United Nations Special Fund. I take particular pride in that. I was also the chairman of the United Nations International School. And during my time, the school was able to acquire a new building. I was able to get a grant of $10 million from the Rockefeller Foundation, and that is the cost of the present building, which is on the East River at 21st Street. That's my small contribution. Then,
what is the program that is being done in the international school?
The United Nations International School is the only school which coaches international students for the baccalaureate course in any university in the world. If you are a graduate of the United Nations International School, you can get straight away admission into any university in the world because it's a recognized baccalaureate program. That is the advantage. It is intended at the school level.
It's a regular school.
It's a regular school.
And it is meant for the children of the Secretariat employees.
Not just that.
Not just that.
It's an international school. All Secretariat members and members of delegations do send their children to the international school. It's an expensive school by any standard, but it's open to others also. In fact, we welcome non-UN people to send their children to the international school so that it can be a truly international affair. That is what the international school is. But I was also responsible, along with Paul Hoffman, for establishing the Fund for Population Act. That is still going strong.
And what about it has got worldwide branches. Population Studies India, Population Project India, is it a part of that one?
Population projects do not have to be part of the Fund for Population Activities, but the Fund for Population Activities does finance demographic projects, projects for research, projects, for example, involving research into how to stop the growth of population and so on, methods of controlling population growth and so on. It finances all those things. The only thing is that the United States has decided that its fund should not be used. United States fund should not be used for any country which uses abortion as a means of population control. That's the only restriction. That's the restriction unilaterally imposed by the United States. Now, Fund for Population Activities, the UNITAR which you mentioned, it was intended as an in-house institution for improving the efficiency of the United Nations. And that was also my contribution. Unfortunately, UNITAR suffered for lack of funding. The Fund for Population Activities has not had that problem, but UNITAR had that problem, and today its resources are very modest, and it's basically a training institution.
To train mainly the Secretariat personnel, is it?
To give
update.
Now there's a proposal to start what's called a staff college under the auspices of UNITAR. That might come about. That will require much more funding than is available now, but basically the United Nations UNITAR is doing that kind of work. I must also mention this United Nations University, which people say is my child.
Yes.
I am not the father of the UN University. Who thought was the father?
You thought, is it?
It was he who, in his introduction to the annual report in 1971, mentioned the possibility of United Nations University. And by 1974, it was an established fact. I was recalling, yesterday I went to a function where the chief guest was the Japanese Consul General, and he came dressed in a dhoti. For some time I could not recognize him. He had invited me last year to the reception held on the occasion of the Emperor's birthday. And I mentioned to him, probably I am the only man in India who has attended a reception by the Emperor of Japan in Tokyo itself.
Is it?
That was in 1974 when we had the first meeting of the United Nations University. So I claim to be the midwife of the United Nations University and not the father. The father was Wutan. But I had the privilege of writing the history of the United Nations University. I have lent you a copy of my book on that subject. That was my contribution to the United Nations activities. I can recall other institutions I have built up, both inside and outside the United Nations, but these are some of the things I recall with great pleasure.
What is the setup? What is the structure of the University of the United Nations? As Vice Chancellor, I would be more interested how it is structured, what are the programs, whether there is one campus and then the people go there and study, or they have different system altogether.
It's a totally different system.
Yes.
The United Nations University Charter calls for it to make an academic contribution towards the solution of global problems, of human welfare and so on.
That's the mandate.
That's the mandate. So, we have got a number of institutes of the United Nations University. For example, the Institute for World International Development Economic Research, it's called WIDER, that's the acronym. It's established in Helsinki, in Finland. We have got Institute for Development in the field of industry, and that is in Maastricht, in the Netherlands. We have had the idea of having an institution for non-conventional source of energy in India. There's still an idea that's being pursued. We have got an institute on computer science in Macau. Now, both Portugal and the People's Republic of China have lent their support. And we have been assured that after Macau becomes part of China, it will still have funding from China for the continuation of the work there. So these are some of the activities. The activities are basically research activities intended to contribute the academic input for the solution of global problems. There is no campus. The headquarters is in Tokyo. The authority in charge of the institution is called the rector. He is at the Undersecretary General level. He is appointed by the Secretary General after consultation with the Board of Trustees, the governing council of the institution. The appointing authorities are jointly UNESCO and the United Nations. It's a joint United Nations UNESCO institute, and the two appointing authorities for the rector or the head of the Secretary General of the United Nations and the Director General of UNESCO. And in fact, there's a search for the next rector now, because the present rector completes his term in the middle of next year. They go through all possible names and so on, and then they give a short list of names. The governing council gives a short list of names to the two appointing authorities, and the two appointing authorities put their heads together and appoint the next rector. The rector is the academic and administrative head of the United Nations University. But under him there are vice rectors, and there's a program in the whole field of social and economic research. And there are institutions, Japan itself, which operate under the aegis of the UNU, and these are all activities which are intended towards this goal, providing an academic input for solution of global problems. That is the charter of the UNU. It is not a campus, does not have a graduate body and alumnus and so on. It's just restricted to this purpose.
But most of they are scattered, stretched out in different countries. There were centers. All of them work under the aegis of the Tokyo headquarters.
And also, existing institutions in countries all over the world can get contracts for doing this work. For example, we have got a nutrition research institute in Mysore that has received contracts from the UNU for contributing, for example, to what is the optimal, cheapest and optimal nutrition which can be provided, suggested to various countries for feeding children, and also for the information of the UNICEF. I forgot to mention UNICEF as one of the biggest institutions we have.
May I ask you to tell us something more about the other organs of the United Nations? According to the Charter, I think they form part of the United Charter. So there are some organs with some kind of special responsibilities given to them. Could you tell us what are those organs of the United Nations which carry out the mandate of the Charter?
First of all, there are the principal organs of the United Nations under the Charter. The principal organs are the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, the Trusteeship Council, and the Secretariat. These are the 5 principal organs of the United Nations. Under the Charter, there is also the provision for an International Court of Justice.
Excuse me, one. I think we did not say much about Trusteeship Council. Could you say something at this stage about Trusteeship Council and what kind of achievements, what work it has done?
I'll be glad to refer to that. So, under the principal organs, you must also include, not as a charter organ, but as a separate entity, the International Court of Justice, which has 15 justices which are elected by the member states from amongst a panel of jurists. The election is by both the Security Council and the General Assembly. Now, the General Assembly is the most universal of all the members of all the principal organs. Every member of the United Nations is a member of the General Assembly. It reflects the principle of the sovereign equality of nations, large and small, as referred to in the preamble to the Charter. The Security Council consists of 15 members, 5 permanent members, and 10 non-permanent members who are elected for a term of 2 years. 5 retire every year, and every year there's an election for 5 members. In fact, this year there is one Asian vacancy for which both Japan and India are competitors. These are permanent members. The permanent members are, of course, the big 5, the United States, Russia, France, United Kingdom, and China. That is the Security Council. We all already know about its responsibilities. The Economic and Social Council is a charter creation which deals with the contribution that the United Nations can make to fulfill the charter obligations to make people better, better standards of life in larger freedom. Human rights, for example, comes under the Economic and Social Council. Social development, the Commission on the Status of Women. By the way, the Commission on Human Rights is a charter body. It is envisaged in the charter itself. The Trusteeship Council was envisaged as a body which would provide assistance to colonies and non-independent countries by having their responsibility entrusted to an administering trust country. For example, for many years, Australia was in charge of Papua New Guinea as a trust territory. But today, with the explosion of the population of the United Nations and all these countries, small countries and big countries becoming independent, all former colonies becoming independent, the Trusteeship Council is rapidly becoming a redundant organization. And a time might come when there is no job for the Trusteeship Council to do, and it might be the first charter body to be formally eliminated. Then, of course, the Secretariat. We know about that. And the Secretary General is the chief administrative officer of the Secretariat, which is a principal organ. The Secretary General is not a principal organ. The Secretariat is. And the Secretary General is the chief administrative officer of the Secretariat. And he is appointed by the General Assembly on the recommendation of the Security Council. In other words, the veto applies to the appointment of the Secretary General.
Also.
Because if there is no formal recommendation from the Security Council, there cannot be a legal appointment of the Secretary General. And therefore, the Secretary General can be appointed by the General Assembly only when it has received a recommendation from the Security Council. These are the 5 charter provisions of 5 charter principal organs.